and welcome to episode 3 of the School of HighTide podcast series supported by Nick Hern Books. My name is Naomi Soneye-Thomas and I'm an emerging writer, producer and host of this podcast, alongside Suba, the artistic director of HighTide, and Chris Sonnex, an associate artist at HighTide and also the curator of this programme. This week we spoke to Ned Glasier, who is the artistic director and founder of Company 3, a youth theatre organisation in Islington that works with young people aged 11 to 19. Their previous work includes a coronavirus time capsule which captured the thoughts and feelings, ideas and stories of lots of young people during the coronavirus pandemic, and it was all done digitally. Also performed at venues such as the National Theatre, Battersea Arts Centre and the platform Islington. I'm super excited to have Ned with us on the programme today to bring his ideas, his expertise, his thoughts about working in community and youth theatre, including how theatre can honour its civic duty to its community. And for any emerging writers out there, how community and youth theatre can be a great way to write scripts for bigger casts than you may be used to or you may be normally allowed to, with lots of resources in iconic venues with a very supportive audience. And it also gave me a few moments to reflect on my process as a writer, which actually is quite important to recognise if you want to bring people into that process. If you can't explain how you do it, how can you truly allow people to be part of it? Hopefully by the end of this episode, anyone who's thinking of working in community theatre or with young people will just feel that little bit more tooled up and ready to go out and engage their community in their art.
I think that young people are not listened to in society. And it's interesting because young people also very rarely get the chance to be a kind of an artist. They rarely get a commission, do they? Or they rarely get a directing gig or whatever. And I'm not saying necessarily that we should give all the 14-year-olds full play writing commissions. Do you know what I mean? What I am saying is that theatre can be a medium through which they might speak. And I think a really crucial role of the artists who work in theatre is to listen really well to young people or to people who aren't necessarily theatre professionals, and to create a space in which they can be heard, and that they might speak out.
When, as you're mainly based in Islington, I imagine you have like a wide mix of young people from lots of different backgrounds. How do you sort of cater for lots of different needs? And do you ever get young people bring in a topic that you just think, how are we going to safely handle that? I guess
I think it's a bit more complex than that, in that we don't generally, what we never say, and I think one of the most, the least useful questions you can ever ask a group of people is the question, what do you want to make a play about? Because in some ways, I think that's the question that always gives you the answer that's like the thing they think you want them to say rather than the thing they really feel. So a lot of the time, the questions we're asking are like, what's going on for you? Or what's in your head right now? Or what are you really obsessed with? Do you know what I mean? Like, what are you really into right now? And also just allowing space for conversation that isn't kind of bordered or boundaried by a workshop leader, you know? So it's about really enjoying those, like the little weird things or the breaks or the trips or the whatever else and the things that come out in those conversations. And then it's about working with a group to kind of work out what feels most important. And of course, some really difficult stuff comes up and some challenging stuff. And I think there's a whole load of things we do as an organisation to keep people safe in that. And sometimes that's about going, no, like one of the things that we do as an organisation, as a company, is that we work really long term with young people. And in the last few years, because I think some of the younger ones in the group have kind of seen the older ones do work that really that exposes something of themselves, that really expresses something important to them. Sometimes the youngest ones have kind of come to us and effectively kind of said, please, can I rip my heart out on stage and cry about this very difficult thing? And sometimes it's okay to say no. Do you know what I mean? Because we don't know you well enough, or we don't know your family, and we don't know what it's going to mean. Because it's fine to maybe express something in a rehearsal room, But then to put it on stage when you've never been on stage before, like I think something I've learned in my time is to be really cautious, because the safety of the people that we work with feels most important.
It's interesting that you say about not going in saying what do you want to make a play about? High Rise did a workshop as part of this School of HighTide thing. And they mentioned that if they go into a hostel or a Pru or somewhere where people automatically look at you with side eye, is what they said. And you're going in there and you're saying, I'm a writer and I want to make a difference to your life, or something that seems so worthy or patronizing, you're not going to connect with that community group or that young person or whoever it is. I was just wondering, like, you've spoken about it a bit already, but just how you sort of talk their language and find that commonality between you. Because I also think sometimes people only go into a community space because they need to tick a box on a Arts Council form, and they're like, yeah, we're going to do these workshops, but really we want to do the play. Like the workshop is a side thing.
And it's kind of based on this idea that I have something to teach you rather than the other way around. I think right at the heart of all of our work is this idea of care and love and respect, and seeing all of the young people that we work with as young artists in and of their own right. And also I think something that happens to teenagers a lot is like they never get met for their own age. They always get met as someone that you can turn into something. So I, like a few years ago, I spoke to this, it's always stuck with me, this 15-year-old girl. And I was working with her in a school that we were doing some work in, and I said, what's it like being 15? And she said, I have no idea what it means to be 15. Like, I don't know what that's like, because everyone's always telling me to be 18, like to get ready, to think about my exams, to think about my future. I think a really big principle in our work is like that we'll meet you for who you are right now rather than trying to turn you into something. And that's both because who you are right now is really great. Do you know what I mean? Like your 13-year-old self is full of really interesting stuff, and like you will never be that age again, and you will never have those views, and you'll never have the brain that you have now. But also because it's not my job to turn anyone into anything. It's my job just to come in and listen and facilitate and make space where people can express who they are.
Yeah, that's really cool because, it is. I feel like we don't enjoy the now enough. It's always like I'm on a journey. It's an end point that I'm trying to get to.
And teenagers most of all, right? Like I don't know, there's no other decade in anyone's life where you are actively being hurried into your next decade. Like, I don't know how old you are, Naomi, but like, you know, if you're in your 20s or your 30s, you don't sit there. I mean, there are a few people who do, but like you don't sit there going, I cannot wait to be 30. Do you know what I mean? Or I cannot wait to be 40. And even when like little kids, like I've got a 3-year-old, I like desperately want to keep him 3 for as long as I possibly can. And then I'm going to really enjoy when he's 4. Do you know what I mean? But like, but in teenage years, we're so scared of teenagers, I think, and we don't really know what to do with them, and they threaten us because they're growing into adults and we don't quite know how to deal with that we're always desperately like pushing them into adulthood. You can see it in how we're dealing with the pandemic right now, right? Like we've got to get the education into them, got to make sure they get to university rather than making sure they're okay now. Yeah.
Okay, I've got one last question before I hand over to Suba.
Hit me.
My question is maybe too vague, but we'll see how it goes. I'm just wondering if you brought a playwright to come and work with you who's not worked with young people before or in community settings before, what are some of the things that make them the best they can be in that job? What are some of the tips and approaches that they can bring to that room, to that rehearsal room?
I guess, first of all, know that it's like the most valid and important theatre work you can do, in my opinion, like, and treat it like that. Do you know what I mean? Understand that working with groups of people and co-creating work with groups of people is a craft of its own right. Like, listen, like, and listen in all the ways, like listen to the things that aren't said, listen to the body language, listen to the things that are like slipped out on the way home, do you know? Or like in a text message, or like at the end of a session or in a break. And I think also like this is a big, like something that I've really thought about over the last 4 or 5 years in my own practice is never pretend that you're not there. I think there's a tendency in like a lot of youth and community work for an artist to pretend they're not there. and to say things like, it's all their own work, it's all their own work. But I know, and we all know, that just by being in a room, I change the dynamic of a room. Like, I know that whatever room I'm in. And that might be for all sorts of reasons. But if someone is in the room, they are part of that room. And I think accepting that is a really empowering thing for any artist to do. So I never say about any work that I make with a group of young people that it's their work. I say it's their and my work, and it can only be created by the combination of me and them. And I think that's much more honest and potentially much less dangerous than pretending that if you hadn't been in the room, that's what all the people in that room would have said. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does, actually. I think you do see that sometimes people come in and they just ignore me. I've just got my notepad and I'm going to be making notes.
You're sitting in the corner. You're sitting in the corner and like, do you know what I mean? Like, whoever you are and whatever identities you bring into the room, they're going to impact the way people talk. And that's just a part of it, right? And of course, that also means you should be, and this I think is as an answer to your earlier question as well, like it means you need to be super aware of what you're bringing into the room and what that will enable and what that will suppress in terms of conversation. And part of my job as the leader of our organisation is making sure that sometimes I'm not in the room, and sometimes other people are in the room, and listening to what the young people need in terms of the artists that they work with. So for me, it's always led by what the young people are needing in that room rather than, for example, who I want to work with.
Okay, nice. I'm going to bring in Suba to talk about your previous work. So Suba, over to you.
Hello, here I am. My microphone is on. I am in full Britney Spears mode. As we're saying to all of the amazing guests we have on this series, you are all artists who profoundly inspire us. And I suppose for us at HighTide, just reflecting on the coronavirus time capsule project that you guys initiated so extraordinarily and rapidly in the first lockdown, in which we were really proud to be part of at HighTide, creating sort of digital youth theatre in the east of England, working with some young people who may otherwise not have had access to any kind of cultural provision through that first lockdown period. And it was astonishing, right? How was it for you?
Yeah, it was really tiring and also really joyful and brilliant. And it what was really beautiful about it for us was that it did something that we wanted to do as an organisation for a long time, which is to think about the role of youth theatre as kind of a civic space where young people could genuinely express themselves and make change and be heard and interpret the world, and to do that not just in little pockets of disconnected companies and groups, but to do that as kind of a big mass of organizations, because we have this amazing youth. It is huge. We must be turning over millions and millions and millions, and no one ever talks about that part of the industry as a part of the industry. It's like a sub part. And so this idea of this power of all these young people linked up in multiple little mini citizens' assemblies expressing themselves and changing the world feels really exciting to me.
I'm going to say something crass, vulgar and mercenary, because I love being tautologist as well, which is just on that, which is, so the incredible Nick Hern Books, who are supporting us in creating this podcast series, Matt Applewhite, the director there, was telling me about, their turnover in terms of things like amateur rights, and actually for many of my playwright friends, getting checks in from youth theatres is a massive, massive part of their income. And it's a really underexplored territory, because actually there are writers out there who are creating extraordinary texts, perhaps in a more traditional sense, some of the ways of working we were talking about earlier. But there is an income stream there, which I think is really important for. But also an opportunity, right? Exactly, yeah.
Like the things you can do in youth theatre as a writer, which you can't do for the first 20 years of your life. Yeah. Like you can write massive plays with like hundreds of people in it, and you can really push the imagination. You can really you get to work in a kind of sector where I don't know, for a long time, Suba, like I was really, really desperate to be validated by theatre world. And then like I realised, actually, I made a play and it didn't go very well and I felt really sad about it. And so I asked the director, Lou Kemp, to come and like just interview the people who'd been involved in the play and like and help us understand what wasn't quite right with it. Like I was really sad while I was making it, and like and she and she wrote this beautiful report back to us, and at the end of it, or during that process, she said something to me which has always really stuck with me. It's like, the thing you need to understand, Ned, is like you have what everyone goes into theatre for, which is like the kind of idea of transformative work and a long-term association with a group of artists. And like, you know, you're not in a 4-week process where you're desperately trying to get something on stage and then you're being judged by the theatre world and that defines your next job, etc., etc. Like you are in a long-term artistic collaborative relationship, and you're doing it in a way that is rooted in community, and you're doing it for audiences that, like, the big theatres are desperately trying to get through their doors and failing mostly, and that changed the way I think about my work a lot, and it stopped me wanting to be validated quite so much by, you know, the big beasts of theatre.
And I think that is a really significant thing when I think about the artists who are engaging with our School of HighTide at the moment in terms of the live sessions, and also those people we hope will have the opportunity to listen to this series, which is there is a massive thing in the sector about how we assess success, and that we do have mechanisms that are consistently encouraging artists to view their work through the lens of what is traditional or the structures that are currently there. And what I find extraordinary about that, and one of our undertakings at HighTide, certainly moving forwards, is, you know, not trying to homogenize the diverse voices that come to us, because actually so much of that is, okay, you're interested in this story. It's, you know, there's something you mentioned earlier as well about listening. And of course, for a writer, perhaps writing that first play or arriving with that thing that they want to tell, that actually is often born out of a very long period of listening to themselves and listening to their community and channeling a frustration. So there has been really intense listening that brings them to that point. And I think really important for artists to be comfortable in that space, especially for emerging writers, to know that they have, perhaps, especially those engaging with this, they've listened for a very long time. But actually that at the point of releasing that out there, a lot of our structures turn into the kind of trad, well, you know, what is the 3-act structure of this? And can you do a draft by then? And this is when we go into rehearsals. And do those processes actually generate the really rich and bold work that truly honours the diversity of perspective that our exciting talent is bringing? And I increasingly think not.
And this is where the opportunity of like youth and community exists, right? Because we don't like, you know, we make our plays over 3 or 4 years because we know that we're not going to produce like the perfect, I mean, whatever perfect is, but we're not going to produce something that we think feels ready in the 12-week term we have, do you know what I mean? Or the 24-week term. So we just start making it again once we've made it once. And you can define your structures much more, and you can kind of work outside, as you say, those kind of trad like structures that exist in a capitalized industry, right?
And I wonder how much more significance those processes would be given if people were actively pointing out that some of that long-term working, that sustained development of idea and concept and getting to know an ensemble over many years is actually just very akin to how the Russian theatres work. But we seem to have lost that connection there. I suppose
because it's expensive, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean, everyone would love that, but it's expensive.
Yeah. But it's interesting that people then ignore or deny the kind of artistic validity of a sector where some of that work is able to happen. You know, because ultimately you're not necessarily paying the actors. So there's something interesting in that. I wondered within all of this, and thinking about some of the people listening, of course, this area and way of working won't be for everyone, which is perfectly valid, of course, and people make in a range of different ways. I'd be interested to hear from you what you feel might be some of the kind of core values, if that's not too loaded a term, or core areas of interest or questions that somebody who wants to move into this realm of making as a writer might need to kind of be holding within themselves as their compass through this?
That's a big question. I think you're right. Like, just to address your point, I think you're right that it might not be everyone's route in, but I also think that some form of collaborative space for people to develop work, like if every playwright writing had the opportunity to take some of their work into community or youth or whatever spaces to re-engage with maybe members of their own community or different communities or whatever, like I wonder if that was built into processes in a much more kind of regular basis, that might be a really amazing shift in our work. That not as a kind of forced thing, but like that, imagine every writer gets 2 weeks of R&D with a group of people that they could define, even if it was like their own family. Do you know what I mean? And they were paid to come and talk about that a bit more, or like, I don't know. In terms of writers getting involved, I don't know what the values might be, but like I'm also really aware of the writers that you are working with in the School of HighTide, and my suspicion is that they will have come to this process because they feel that they have big stories to tell, and that they do have real roots in who they are and where they've kind of emerged from in their lives. And like I think like the idea of perhaps something that maybe lessens a load is that often it's a real solo pressure on a playwright. Like often playwrights, I think, feel really like under a lot of pressure to go and sit in their room and to type furiously on their keyboard or stare blankly at their screen until something comes out. But that perhaps, I don't know, for lots of people, finding space to discuss their work or to test little bits out or to develop feels like a real liberating thing, that it doesn't have to be all out of you, that it can be like crafted from the relationships or conversations that you have with a whole range of different people. I don't know if that's useful.
I think so. And I think what's interesting within that, and I was reflecting on this when you were talking to Naomi earlier, and another of our kind of episodes in the series is with wonderful Debbie Hannon looking at research, which is, there is this kind of pervasive myth that you do lock yourself up and then something kind of flows from God through you and ends up on the screen or on the page somehow. I just don't think that truly reflects the ways in which any writer that I know is actually making work, because we do workshop, we do play, we do research, we do ask questions. Virtually every new writing process I've been in has been, motored by at least a moment where it's about mucking about and improving and asking questions with a group of wonderful actors, certainly. Other of the work I've done, community consultation, we've especially been, when we've commissioned work that's really hitting on kind of, challenging social themes, wanting to explore with audiences why we might be telling this story and stuff like that. So I feel like some of those processes exist, but aren't spoken about. I think that's right. They're not clear, right? And also that you can't ask for it, perhaps. Do you know what I mean? That it's kind of like someone decides, I mean, I'm sure not with you, but like that someone decides that now's the time to workshop your play, that you have to have brought a certain amount of whatever to that thing. Yeah. And I think a thing within that as well, and something I would really want to encourage any writers listening to this to think about, is this thing about legitimacy, which is, it's very difficult as the solo artist to invite other voices into your process. That may come from sometimes insecurity, which it does. It may come from because you're so holding on to that thing that it's difficult to let go of it and share it with other people. I would say it's important to find that muscle, because you're going to have to let go of it at some point. Otherwise, it ain't ever going to get on. And
perhaps this is where I think that you the whole youth and community sector of can be really useful, because one, when you work with young people and you take work to them, I find them both to be incredibly generous and also really honest. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, God, yeah.
And so maybe it's harder to, maybe the workshopping process with a group of actors and a literary manager and whatever else, and an artistic director and another director, whatever, there's a lot of pressure in that room, even if everyone's incredibly nice and really constructive and whatever else. But actually sometimes this other space where you can bring some lines, or you can bring a character and you go, what do you think of that? And what does that mean to you? And who do you know is a bit like that? It just feels like there's a wider, and the beautiful thing about that in a wider theatre sense is that I think that if I was involved in in helping someone R&D their work, I'm more likely to come and see it when it's on.
Exactly.
And there's something about I hate these words, but audience development in that, right? There's something about kind of, encouraging the people, investing people in a process so that they might then feel some ownership of the end result as well. Yeah, and you can do that as a writer informally, or you can do it, you can advocate and ask your commissioning theatre or whatever it is to set that up for you.
Yeah, and also if you are that independent practitioner out there without that commissioning structure around you, finding the confidence to, which, I'm afraid we can't give that confidence to people solely through a motivational podcast. But all I would ever say, and as I consistently say to writers, if it's exciting to you, if it matters to you, it will matter to other people. And there will be people out there who will want to spend time with you thinking through the things that affect you that also affect them. And finding those communities is,
and often writers might think that in order to start a process collaboratively, they have to work with theatre makers. But as with directors as well, I'll often say, go and find the local community group to you. Do you know what I mean? Or go and visit a load of other groups who aren't making theatre and speak to them, because they might hold more answers than you think they do.
Yeah. And, and in those answers, you may also find some absolutely killer lines that you can chuck straight into the text.
Yeah, exactly.
On that
note, brilliant.
Exactly. But that's the thing. They are. And I suppose what sits at the heart of this is people and that connection, and actually build it into the process if you can, because, you're going to have to open your doors to them at the end.
Shuba, can I say one more thing as well, which is, you talked earlier about this idea of sitting in a room and then kind of some lightning flash happens and a play emerges out of you. And I think that's one of the things that as an organisation working with writers, and by writers I mean people who call themselves playwrights and people in the room who want to write, and it's a spectrum, isn't it, rather than a binary thing And one of the things that we work really hard on is trying to understand the process of making theatre as a process, as a craft, rather than as an act of God. Because as soon as it becomes an act of magic or an act of God, I think it becomes very exclusive. And I think a lot of power that's held in theatre right now is held because we believe that only some people have a kind of right to make theatre and know how to do it. And so a lot of our work, and the thing that I'm going to bring to the School of HighTide, I think, is about answering the question, how do you make a play? As a solo artist, as a writer, or as a group of people working collaboratively. And until we feel really confident, often I train people who call themselves theatre makers, and I say, hands up who knows how to make a play. And a lot of, it's, everyone's very, very shy of that question. But it's weird, isn't it? Because if we were all tractor makers, and I said, hands up who knows how to make a tractor, everyone would know how to make a tractor.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about having confidence that it is a craft and that there is process, rather than you have to sit there and be something erupt out of you because you're skilled or talented, I think is really important too.
Well, it is. And it is, and I would always say there's classism inherent in that, because this thing about being touched by God while you're sort of idly sat around at home waiting for inspiration. Well, there are very few people who can afford that reality, and we have to be aware of that. But there is something, and I think you're exactly right to speak to this. There is some willful kind of smoke and mirrors around those creative processes, and the idea that it is process, the idea that there are a set of tools you can use to crack an idea open, that I think that's
democratizing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, do you think that, like if you know the tools and you develop your own tools, then that's democratizing, right?
Exactly. On that subject, I'm going to bring in Democrat-in-Chief, Mr. Chris Sonnex.
Have you ever been called Democrat-in-Chief, Chris?
Never at all. I was just thinking about that, actually, as an interesting thing about the idea that there's a hierarchy and this gift of God as an artist, and we know how to do certain things. And I think I was thinking about that in relation to the divisionary sort of tactics that happen when it comes down to youth and community theatre and lessering it. And I wonder whether it's sort of the work that you do and many others do that I thank you for every day. That work is lessered by some people because it devalues the idea that there's that these people have this meritocracy, that they've got there because they're better than everybody. But actually, if 26 young people make a far better play from a deprived area in London, than this person that really believes in this idea of meritocracy. Which doesn't exist, do you know?
And it's also about what makes a good play, right? We made this play called Brainstorm ages ago, and it did really well. And I don't think it's because anyone on that stage was a particularly... I mean, some of them were good actors, do you know what I mean? But not all of them were good actors, and they haven't all gone on to be good actors. They've not all gone on. But it's the fact they stood up and told a story that meant something. It wasn't about technique. And I think one of the beautiful things about theatre is that it doesn't always need to be great technique. It can actually just be standing in front of a crowd and saying something that costs you something, that connects in some way, that's meaningful. And so I think that flips that idea of also like perfect dialogue or perfect play structure or anything like that on its head as well.
Yeah, I do. I always feel like it's about what that feeling is. I've sat through many a play that from big theatres that has left me feeling absolutely nothing, and I just can't get on board with that. And
but I bet they were technically great.
Yeah, I'm completely 100%. You go, well, this is brilliant, but actually, it's not making me feel anything. And I don't think I've ever sat through, no matter how well structured or how brilliant it's been, a young person's piece of work and not felt something at some point. And speaking of feeling something, I wanted to ask you a question which I'm going to ask all the guests, which is about albums. I know it's quite a difficult thing to pin down. I was just thinking about it there, where I don't think I could answer this question without listing about
you can't answer your own question.
400 albums. but one of the reasons that I wanted to bring it up to you, there's many reasons why I asked this question. I find it infinitely interesting. But I used to do this when I did loads of community work in Tottenham with loads of different groups of people for the Royal Court. One of the things that I used to really was the thing that really was easy to engage with was music. Theatre seemed to be quite a difficult thing to engage with. And I figured it's because music's quite accessible. It's sort of everywhere and it's easy to get to, whereas theatre isn't necessarily the thing. And I wanted to know how music affects you, which is why I wanted to know about your sort of most influential album. But one of the other reasons that I want to know is because you spend so much time doing such brilliant work with the young people in Islington. But we never hear that much about you as an artist. And I always want to sort of interrogate that a little bit further. So here's my opportunity to do that.
My favourite album is an album called Boxer by a band called The National. It's like super melancholy. like post-rock album. It's kind of low, like, but it's followed me for a lot of my life and through a lot of festivals and gigs. And it's not something I'd ever play in our room, but maybe I should one day and see how they go.
I think you should. I think there's something. Listen, I think there's something about the beauty of music being able to be sort of traded and given to people, and it's okay whether you don't like a piece of music in the way that it's okay that you don't like a play or this.
Do you know what's sad, Chris?
Or
sometimes, or sad and happy at the same time, is that sometimes we'll do some work with them where they bring in like their parents, like the kind of inheritance songs from their parents, and they're all songs from like my childhood, and I'm really unhappy about it. Oh shit.
I do a similar thing to you when it comes to music in the rehearsal room, and I've been working with young people a lot recently as well, and they keep coming in with like songs that are like, oh, this is a real old school track, and I'm like, oh yeah, cool. I was 26 in the club when that came out. That's
so upsetting.
Yeah. Damn you.
Or when they all go, yeah, that's really 90s. I was like, oh, I was there.
Yeah, I existed in that time.
Yeah.
What was that album again, so people can check it out?
It's called Boxer, and it's by The National.
I wanted to know also about a piece of advice that you would give yourself when you were starting out, that might be helpful for some of the writers listening in today, or any artists in general that are listening in.
What would I give myself?
It's a bold, big question, isn't it?
No, it's a good one. Like, do you know what? Actually, as an artist, I have really wobbly foundations. In that I'm not saying take a traditional route at all, but I think I tried to lead before I was ready to. I think if I'm super honest about it, like really hungry to prove myself, do you know what I mean? And like, to be good and to be respected and like all that stuff. Like, I guess my advice is twofold actually. One is don't worry about that. And two is to take the time to learn, and because you've got a long journey, you know, like I work with a lot. I've spoken in the last year, particularly during the pandemic. I think a really difficult age to be in the pandemic is 27. Because there's that kind of, I think at 27, 28, and of course this will be different for different people, different, you know, coming in at different stages. But like, I think you're often like, what am I doing with my life? And, you know, like, what's the next step and stuff like that. And like, but you've got so much time, do you know what I mean? Like to learn and work with other people and to build your foundations. Something we say in our work is that, like, often when people make plays, they do a very small amount of research and try and balance their play on top of it, right? And it's much more likely to topple over, I think, that if you have a really broad base of research in the making of a play, you can always go back to it and dig something else out and continue to build your play up high. And I think the same is in your career. Like, try lots of stuff out, learn lots, spread yourself wide, you know, and develop your craft before you try and make your signature show.
Love it. That's great. I wanted to end on a bit of hope. Same as Joy. I wanted to know what your hopes for theatre are in the next coming years.
Where do we start? I'll give you a specific one and then a general one. We have worked over the last year with about 300 youth theatres in the UK. I knew this, I think, deep down, but I've seen it now, and I've seen it on Zooms. And I think youth theatre, like a lot of theatre, but youth theatre, and there's even more of a reason why this is dangerous and wrong, has a huge diversity problem, a huge representation and equity problem in its leadership. There are not enough Black and Asian leaders of youth theatres, not enough youth theatres from Latin American heritage, not enough leaders who truly represent their community. And I think if the youth theatre sector is going to do what I really want the youth theatre sector to do, which is become maybe this is the second thing, right? A space of like huge civic responsibility, a space where young people can really be heard, because we've got the infrastructure, right? Like just a lot of the time we're not doing that work. Like we're making plays about adults where young people dress up as adults. But if we're really going to make it a space where art can function as a space for civic, societal transformation, then we need a more representative leadership of it. So I think those two things are linked, actually. But that's like, I'd like to see youth theatre leading the conversation and leading the way society listens to young people. And in order to do that, I think we need a much more representative leadership of it.
I share that hope. Could you end, Ned, on giving us
yes, I can.
Company? Yeah, can you end? Company Three's logo.
Our rules.
Catchphrase, the rules. Yeah.
Yeah, I can. Do you know what? These rules are the rules that I kind of said off the top of my head when I walked into the room when I first started working with what wasn't even then Company 3, but became Company 3 later. And they've stuck with us ever since. So I think they came from a good place of instinct. And I said, we're not going to have any rules because young people have too many rules in their lives, and they do. But we're going to have 3 rules only, and they're all going to be positive. And they are: be kind, be brave, and be yourself. And I've never, ever had a situation in our work where I've had to make up a new rule. Do you know what I mean? We've always been able to refer anything that's ever happened in our work to one of those 3 things.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Ned.
Thank you.
This podcast was produced by HighTide and supported by Nick Hern Books and Lansons. It was made possible with support from the Culture Recovery Fund. It was presented and produced by myself, Naomi Soneye-Thomas, and co-presented by Chris Sonnex and Suba. Chris Sonnex also worked as a co-creator on the podcast. It was recorded by Callum Swingler and edited by Liam Cameron, and featured original artwork by Dragonfly Design. Links to references and resources discussed in this episode can also be found at www.hightide.org.uk, where you can also subscribe to HighTide's newsletter and donate to the theatre company. If you'd like to follow HighTide on Twitter, their handle is @_HighTide_. And don't forget, if you'd like to join in with the discussion in today's episode, you can do so on social media using the hashtag School of HighTide.